the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, CIRC, and Colorado Refugee Speakers Bureau, the Lutheran Family Services, Professor Rojo from the Sociology Department at CC, and Ms. Heather from the founder of Refugee Alliance. First off, I want to thank all the panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us. I hope today is to give you a sense of the community, the immigrant and refugee community, and the experiences locally and nationally, and how you can get yourself involved in the work that is being done in that issue area. My name is Peniel Owusu-Ansah, and I'm the CC's Immigrant and Refugee Justice Issue Organizer. My role is to act as a coalition builder and connector to deepen and inspire work in this issue area. This is one of the 9 issue-based panels which are going to be hosted between Block 5 and 6, and we invite you all to attend any of them which interest you. I'll be joined today with my co-facilitators, Melanie and Olivia today, who are co-captains of Refugee Alliance. This panel is a part of a larger effort of the community collaboration for community engagement co-op to bring campus community members together on important social issue. And through educational events and coalition building, we hope to facilitate informed engagement through better coordination and spread awareness of what our campus and community are already doing, and better connect people to get involved in the actions that are going on in this issue area. So if you're interested in joining this issue organization, please, you can email me directly or look up coalitions at the CCE account and you'll be added to the list there. We're excited that you're here, and we'll now begin the panelist introductions, followed by a roughly 30 minutes of coordinated discussions. And I want you to know that you have an opportunity after the panel moderated questions in our final 15 minutes. So feel free to pose questions as well as respond to panelists using the chat feature. Thank you.
Okay, so for our panelist introductions, we would like you all to share your name, personal pronouns, the organization you're representing, or the type of community work you engage in, your role, what you do, and then what your organization or what your group focuses on.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, whoever wants to start first. And it's basically keep your introduction as brief as possible, since we'll have our moderate questions where you can elaborate more later.
Okay, well, in short, my name is Nermina Mujkanovic. I am originally from Bosnia. I'm a former refugee from Bosnia. I've been in the States for a very long time, though. I am here today representing the Colorado Refugee Speakers Bureau. We are a program that's a part of 3 different resettlement agencies. And so I'm representing them here today. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Thank you.
I can go ahead and hop in next. My name is Brittney Carroll Hatcher. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work as a case coordinator with Lutheran Family Services, Rocky Mountains in Colorado Springs. And so we're one of the 3 refugee resettlement agencies that is also affiliated with the Refugee Speakers Bureau. We're specifically serving clients in the Colorado Springs area around oftentimes refugees, but other populations as well. So we can get into that later.
We're not able to hear you.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Perfect. Oh, sorry, y'all. Yeah, so hi, my name is Nayda. I organize with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. And yeah, I'm excited to be here today. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And yeah, I organize primarily in Southern Colorado. And so for our purposes, that also includes Colorado Springs.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Rojo in the sociology department. I'm an assistant professor here at CC. I teach a variety of classes related to immigration, including a immigration course that we just wrapped up in J Block. I'll be teaching a Sanctuary Cities in the US course in Block 7. And my research and scholarship generally centers on issues of violence, trauma, and immigration. And my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heather Powell Brown. I'm the Assistant Director of Global Education at Colorado College. And in 2015, I helped found the CC Refugee Alliance, which has kind of morphed to be part of the Immigrant and Justice Coalition through the CCE to streamline all of our efforts. But yeah, we've tried to draw together at CC all the different ways through refugee, to working with Lutheran Family Services, working with immigrant accompaniment programs, sanctuary coalitions, CERC, different groups in the Springs that are working with all kinds of various aspects. My office works with both incoming international students as well as outgoing study abroad students. And so that kind of has fostered my interest in collaborating this kind of work at CC. So it's been a very rich 5 years working in the Springs. There's a lot of activity that I wasn't aware about before we started the coalition. So welcome, everybody.
Okay, so did everyone introduce themselves? I think everyone got to everyone. Okay, yay! So now we'll begin our moderated questions part. So for our panelists, feel free to share as you feel moved to do so, but we don't have to go in any particular order, and everyone doesn't have to respond to a question, but you're all welcome to if you would like to. And so our first question is, in what ways are you engaging directly or more broadly with immigrant and refugee populations in Colorado Springs?
I guess I can go ahead and jump in first. So as I mentioned, I work with Lutheran Family Services Rocky Mountains in the Refugee and Asylee program. So we are serving what we often refer to as Office of Refugee Resettlement Populations in Colorado Springs. So that includes refugees, and those are individuals who have been granted refugee status prior to coming to the United States. But we also are serving individuals who have been granted asylum, Cuban, Haitian entrants, and international victims of trafficking. And so for the systems can be a little bit complex, so I won't really dive into them too much right here. But for refugee arrivals, we are connected with them prior to their arrival to the United States. And so we pick them up at the airport and sort of once we are notified of their travel, we start immediately working on their case. But for the other populations that we are able to serve, we do rely on walk-ins or referrals from community partners so that we're able to serve those clients. And so our services consist of a lot of case management, cash assistance, health services, employment services, which is a really main component of our program. And we have other programs as well that we're able to connect clients to. So.
I can go next. So the Colorado Refugee Speakers Bureau is not necessarily, our speakers do engage across the state. I wouldn't say that I personally have interactions with Colorado Springs, but I've engaged in a few different speaking engagements. But what our group does is we are a group that was formed about a few years ago, maybe 3 to 4 years ago, and we are all former refugees or special immigrant visa holders who engage with the local community or communities across Colorado to share our stories. And our stories are not just stories regarding our refugee experience, but our interconnect or our intersectional identities that make up who we are. So the intention behind our group is just bringing a voice to refugees to be able to share their own stories and share it in the way that they feel most comfortable. So that's what we do. We are located in Denver, but we do engage with communities across Colorado. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, I can share. So CIRC is a statewide organization, but like I mentioned earlier, I primarily support and organize alongside immigrant communities in Southern Colorado. And because of the immigrant population in Southern Colorado, I mostly tend to work with undocumented immigrants. And so that can look like a variety of ways. So right now, right, because of the pandemic, it looks like getting a lot of calls from community members and just trying to connect them to different resources, especially because, you know, unfortunately, many undocumented folks are barred from accessing financial resources during this time and other resources. And so, yeah, you know, my work right now is definitely connecting a lot of community to whatever like resources or networks are available to support them in this really difficult time. Another aspect, or two other aspects of my work, so one is community organizing, right? And so that's really working with community to address like certain issues systemically and structurally. And so that is connected to the policy advocacy that we do at CIRC. So every year we introduce 2 bills into the state legislature because we believe that we also need to change policy and laws here in Colorado to be able to protect and advocate for immigrant communities. Yeah, and so right now, I won't talk about those bills just yet, but yeah, a lot of the work is looking like advocating for those policies and supporting immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, amid a global pandemic.
Okay, if no one else would like to share anything else, we can move to our second question, which is please help us to understand the local context, including why this issue matters to essentially immigrant and refugee justice, why it matters in Colorado Springs, and how this compares to the national or international context.
I can take a shot kind of at this one and at the first question as well. So in 2015, when we started the Refugee Alliance at CC, I think I started it out of a genuine, I didn't know how refugees arrived in the US. There was a lot of discussion at that time about Syrian refugees and where they could be settled state by state. Governors were going around and saying if they would take Syrian refugees or not, you know, that it as if they had a choice to pick and choose which countries that had qualified for refugee resettlement status. And in Colorado, there was a lot of discussion and debate at that time. And in Colorado Springs, there was I forget the word, a resolution brought before city council by one of our city council people that basically, you know, was advocating for stopping all refugee resettlement in Colorado Springs. And there was a lot of misinformation flying around that and a lot of people didn't know. A lot of seemingly, you know, well-intentioned people were echoing all of these unfounded statements about refugees and about threats and about just a lack of understanding about the process. And so I kind of, through connecting with Lutheran Family Services, did some trainings at CC, and just this outpouring from our local community of students, faculty, staff, but also community members, former military people that had retired here, just all kinds of people came, and we had a lot of trainings at CC. And it I think really opened my eyes to sort of the broad range of efforts that are going on in Colorado Springs in all different areas for people with different statuses, right? And so I'm pleased that we've got so many different organizations represented here today. I'm sharing some in the comments as well. I mean, the people that have spoken and upcoming trainings and things we'll share. But just a variety of ways to get involved for people with different backgrounds, linguistic skills. I think sometimes people think Colorado Springs isn't as diverse in terms of languages spoken or people groups here, not compared to other areas or other big cities. And what I've found through this work is that there really is a very broad variety. We've connected students who have studied abroad or who are here from other countries who have studied languages that they didn't realize that there was an opportunity to use those linguistic skills with these people groups that are here in Colorado Springs and surrounding communities. So yeah, it's been very eye-opening, the diversity to me of the different people groups and languages that are represented here, the different statuses, and then the different efforts that are going on from very intensive mentoring and tutoring of individuals to shorter term projects that students have been involved in, and faculty and staff at CC, advocacy. There's really, we've tried to have a variety of different ways that students and faculty and staff can get involved. And I've been very pleasantly surprised at all the things that are going on and how CC students have gotten involved.
Yeah, sorry, Brittney, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, just to build a little bit off of what Heather is saying. I mean, part of the reason I'm not speaking up too much is because I really do want to defer to these local experts on the panel who do this real on the ground work here in Colorado and in our region. My work is primarily not based in Colorado Springs, or hasn't been in the past, although I hope it will be moving forward more. My scholarship and fieldwork has been primarily based in the San Francisco Bay Area with Central American immigrants there, as well as in central Mexico with immigrants in transit, Southern Mexican and Central American immigrants in transit through Mexico on their way to the United States. And that includes both, my sociological research and also some of my community work in community responses to policing. So I worked in San Francisco with on a case where a young undocumented Guatemalan man was killed by police in my community, and there was just a lot of organizing around that. So I'm hoping to bring some of those experiences and lessons and ground it in my work here. But really, as Heather so well articulated, that there's just a lot of work happening in town and in the region already. And part of my mission is just to sort of learn about and highlight these efforts and have people like Nayda come into my classes and talk with my students about this work. But just sort of thinking a little bit about the national context, I think, and my last class, which I called Crimmigration, sort of emphasized this point throughout, which is we've been in this increasingly in this moment of a convergence between the criminal legal system and the immigration legal system. And there's just this overwhelming process of criminalizing non-citizens in the United States, including undocumented immigrants, but also all non-citizens, right? Anyone who's not a US citizen. And there's been this really harmful and false conflation of immigrants and non-citizens with criminality, as well as this sort of problematic lifting up of the ideal immigrant, I think, in response to that. And so I see this as really being part of the larger problem and the larger context that people working in immigrant rights, immigrant justice, immigrant and refugee issues in the United States are sort of grappling with. And as we're moving, and I know I'm hoping we'll talk a little bit about kind of what is going to happen now with the new administration and how much what kind of hopes we're pinning on the new administration to make change and what kind of things we need to be demanding. But this is a process that's been happening for decades now in the United States. And a lot of what Heather's pointed to about, like not wanting to receive immigrants or refugees here in town, I think is reflective of that broader ideology, which which I think is really central to kind of thinking about and imagining immigrant justice is, how have these systems been conflated? How is deportation used as a punishment when it's meant to be an administrative process? When is deportation necessary, if at all? Like, do we even need deportations in the United States, or are there other ways to deal with, communities here? So I guess, I mean, this is part of what I'm thinking about. Like, how is this happening here locally? How are people being criminalized? And we can see, for example, nearby in Aurora, there's a detention center, right? Like there are people being held in these atrocious conditions, and it's simultaneously the people who are being framed and sort of labeled as criminals in the United States, as well as people who are who are categorized in different ways, like legal permanent residents, right? Who are seen as coming here the right way, getting in line, doing things properly. And these are obviously not my own words, but sort of how immigration discourses frame various non-citizens. So I guess I'm just sort of curious, for people who do the work here and who have been doing real direct service work with communities, like how the rest of us can really support your work, because there's a lot to be done. But I guess that's my 2 cents on kind of what I think the national context is looking like. And it didn't start with the Trump administration, but his administration accomplished over 400 immigration related policies, and it's going to take a lot more than a single president to reverse that.
Does anyone want to add anything to that? Oh, shoot. Go ahead.
Brittney, did you want to add something? Sorry, I was gonna add something, but
No, you can go ahead first, and I'll
no,
follow you. Well,
go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Well, initially, I had just wanted to kind of touch upon what Heather had been speaking about in terms of the resolution that City Council did put forth in, I guess, 2015 or 16. I can't remember exactly which year it was, but I do think working in refugee resettlement, I think this field really kind of exemplifies your question, in that it really is addressing a global issue. There's over 20 million refugees around the world, but it really brings it to a local context, because you are working with people who are starting over in Colorado Springs, who need support from community members to help them learn to integrate, to help help improve English, help around employment and securing good jobs. And so we always draw a lot of support from the Colorado Springs community, whether that's Colorado College, or we have a lot of partners in other nonprofit organizations, as well as local churches and other groups. And so I think there's a lot of ways to get involved working around newly arrived refugees, and we are excited to see sort of how that grows with the new administration.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, and I don't necessarily want to speak, or I'm not speaking as much about refugees because I don't work with them as closely, and so I'll definitely defer to Brittney on this. But I guess when you think about local issues here that are rising, right, related to like the undocumented community, you see like a huge number of like just unemployment has spiked, right? And this includes unemployment for undocumented folks, right? And the pandemic has really just created these dynamics that were already there, but really like allows like for the continued exploitation of undocumented workers. many of them working in the city's restaurants, right? Many of them like on the front lines of this pandemic. And so you can attribute that to a lot of things, but I think at the root of like why we don't see support for undocumented communities in this time is can be traced back to what Florencia said about the criminalization of immigrants, right? Like who is worthy of being supported right now, who doesn't get to get a check from the government, right? And so you know, like locally, that's a huge issue right now, right? Like undocumented folks like fearing and also not like lack of resources and education around what resources are available to them, what because there are so many different policies that are actually somewhat inclusive of undocumented folks, but people don't know about it. Institutions don't know about it, right? Like there are certain policies right now that allow for that support undocumented folks that are going to the ER or going to the hospital because of COVID. People don't know about that, both like the institution and the community member. Yeah, there's just like not as much public knowledge around like what kind of resources are available, and if there are, they're not super accessible to the community at this time. And you know, like we still see like issues like deportation and detention, like in Southern Colorado, in Trinidad, which is like 2.5 hours away from here. You know, like that county is still actively working with ICE. And like there was like a detention and or a couple of detentions and deportations from that county at the end of last year, right? Like these things are like actively like happening, they continue to happen. And yeah, I mean, it can be attributed to a lot of things, but I really do think it's that criminalization of immigrants in our systems. And yeah, I don't know, like there's just so many things that like you could talk about. Like immigration is like so racialized. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's just really heartbreaking. And I think like I think this is a question later, but like it's just really, really heartbreaking to me that we're letting people die in this like global pandemic. People that like could have could possibly still be alive if they, you know, had access to more support from their local and state and federal government. People that could have still been alive if they knew that actually there are resources if you go to the emergency, to the ER or to the hospital because of COVID. Actually, you don't have to just stay home because you're afraid of like the bills piling up. And I mean, like you don't have to like stay home if you're sick with COVID. Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I'm specifically talking about the pandemic because that's what I see a lot of now. It's just really heartbreaking and frustrating, right? And so I think like a way that folks can support is definitely looking at like mutual aid networks, at local organizations that are providing resources to directly impacted folks at this time, right? So I'll like put some of the information in the chat, but there's like Grupo Esperanza in Colorado Springs, right? A group of undocumented mothers that's providing funds to immigrants without legal status at this time. There's the accompaniment program and Sanctuary Coalition of Colorado Springs. They do incredible work as well. But I think really I'm big on wealth redistribution. And I think like if folks have the funds to like support these incredible like grassroots organizations doing a lot of the direct work, then we should be doing that. But the government also, right, of course, like we need to like change policy and try to also advocate for structural changes. Sorry, that was kind of all over the place, but yeah.
I think there were, I'll try to be short because I think there were a lot of great comments made across the immigration spectrum. But when I'm thinking about the refugee community, I think about the last 4 years, and then I think about this pandemic, and I'm specifically focusing on that time frame, not intentionally excluding this history of hate and that's been so prevalent throughout our policies, our structures, but just focusing on the last 4 years, I would say that to Brittney's point, we're at the highest number of refugees in the world that we've ever had. Less than 1% of refugees get resettled. So the few of us who actually make it feel incredibly lucky and are incredibly lucky. It is sort of like a lottery. And I think about the last 4 years and then this pandemic, and I think about all the trauma that our refugee community members come with to the US. We often talk about the lack of support, and there certainly is a lack of support. No one's getting free money from the government. Nothing comes for free, and I think that that's often a stereotype. But on top of all of that, there's this, you have to survive, but, there's a lack of mental health care. And I think about the pandemic and how the pandemic has made that worse for a lot of folks. A lot of folks find their dignity in the work that they do and being able to keep busy and provide for their families after surviving war or genocide, and losing their livelihood often triggers them in ways that we don't always expect. And so I think about a lot of my friends, in the Speakers Bureau, a lot of my family members who have been impacted by the pandemic. And then, obviously the last 4 years under the Trump administration, there has been a lot of triggering moments. And under the Trump administration, it was constant. And I, for my parents, for example, my mom used to tell me at the very beginning of this, the Trump administration, she used to tell me it reminded her of the rhetoric right before the war hit Bosnia. And that is terrifying. And for a lot of my friends, we all started feeling a lot of anxiety because I think in America, if you're born here, there's this narrative that nothing bad can happen in America, that we are a country that, has progressed. If you're not a person of color, then nothing bad can happen to you. But historically, there have been horrible things that have happened in this country. But one thing that a lot of folks kept telling me is, get it out of your head that, we could fall apart as a country, that this country can become a dictatorship. And I always looked at folks and I always wondered, what gave you that idea that you're so special that we can't fall apart in that way? What gives folks this idea that we are a country that can't succumb to chaos? And if we look back on the last 2-3 weeks, we are a country that can succumb to chaos. And we have to be very careful. So when I'm thinking about the local context, I see a lot of fear. I see a lot of, just folks feeling triggered again. And then when I look at the international context, I see us not meeting the needs. We are absolutely not meeting the needs. We, as a country, cut our refugee numbers to historic lows, something that I don't think many people, even anti-immigrant folks with anti-immigrant sentiment, would have expected. And that's devastating for anyone who's watching what's happening globally. Syria was happening globally when we were cutting these numbers. And I realize that these are really difficult realities for folks to contend with and to sit with. But this is what folks are living with. And for a lot of refugees, we see those images and it's a trigger, and it breaks our hearts that someone would turn away folks again. And so I think at this point, we have a lot of work to do. Policies were brought up, absolutely. We have structural changes that we need to address and to implement and codify into law so that Administrations, folks who are anti-immigrant, don't just get to come into office and change everything. And it's not even reflective of the populace. Like, the public polling on immigration is very favorable. So I just think we have a lot of work ahead of us. I'm optimistic, but we have a lot of work. We have a lot of work to do locally, and we have a lot of work to do nationally and internationally on this issue.
Great, thank you all for your thoughtful responses. Our next question is, do you see the current administration aiding the organizations you work with or your own work and improving the ways that you can support immigrants and refugees? What are your hopes and what are your doubts?
I guess I can go ahead and jump in with some positive news that we've had regarding refugee resettlement. So the Biden administration has indicated that they are going to raise the presidential determination, which is the refugee ceiling. So the maximum number of refugees that would be admitted during a fiscal year. So they've indicated that they're going to raise the number for this fiscal year that we're currently in from 15,000, where it's at currently, to 62,500, which is amazing news. It's the previous administration had it set below this number for the previous past 4 years. So it's definitely much higher than it's been in recent years. And alongside that, they also indicated that for the next federal fiscal year, starting October 1st, that the number will be set at 125,000. And so that is 125,000 refugees that could be admitted nationwide. Of course, with policies that have been in place over the past 4 years, we don't expect to see those numbers immediately. A lot of the systems that were in place to screen and process refugee arrivals have really been diminished over the past 4 years. And so I know the Biden administration has put, I believe they've signed it, an executive order to try to improve these systems again, but even so, it will still take some time, but at least that is some positive news that we've heard just in the past week.
Yeah, I I think it's really interesting because I guess I've heard a lot since I'm like in immigration policy spaces a lot. I don't necessarily hear, and I don't know why it is. Maybe it's because it's nonprofit spaces, but I don't hear as much criticism about like the current administration as I think there should be. Right? I think like it's awesome that we're seeing all of these like different executive orders and like that proposal that came down from the Biden administration, which I guess I just want to remind folks is just a proposal, right? Like there are things mentioned in that proposal that need to be codified into policy, into law, and that hasn't been done yet. And so like, but like it's awesome, right, to see just different executive orders, you know, there was an executive order reinstating DED or deferred enforcement departure for Liberians, which is awesome. An executive order rescinding like the zero tolerance policies under Trump, right? Executive orders ending discriminatory bans in the US. Like all of that is incredible, but I think there's still so much that needs to be done. And my worry is, right, that I think like a lot of what needs to happen, they need to be permanent protections. They need to be like legislated. And in order for that to happen, like Congress is obviously involved, right? And so like we're going to need legislators to pass policies yeah, so I guess like what I'm worried about is gridlock, is you know, I don't know if like folks keep up with the news like in or locally, but you know, Senator John Hickenlooper, he just like, I think it was last Friday or Thursday, he voted against an amendment in one of the federal stimulus packages to include undocumented workers, right? That's a slap in the face to immigrant communities that, and to CERC, right? Like, I guess just full disclosure, CERC endorsed him. So yeah, I mean, you can't trust politicians, you can't trust legislators, and I think like they actively need pushing. The Biden administration will actively need pushing. There's just, yeah, there's so much that needs to be done, and also I think we need to be paying attention to the Biden administration's foreign policy and what we're doing outside of the U.S. Right? Like, how are we intervening? Like, what is happening outside? Because I guess, you know, just as a reminder, like so many people are immigrating, or, you know, not necessarily immigrating, because for some folks it's not a choice, right? They're fleeing their home countries, right? It's because of conditions that were created, and sometimes, a lot of times, not solely because of their own country, right? It's because of other countries, because of foreign policy from the US and from other places. And so I think that it's awesome to see visions that have been laid out by the Biden administration, but we need to continue pushing and pay close attention to their messaging, to what they're saying, to what they're what they are wanting to push, who they're excluding, because, you know, like they really want, they have talked about a pathway to citizenship for folks, right? But when we know that there will be criminal carve-outs, right? Like, who are they excluding? Like, who is being included? Like, how is a good versus bad immigrant narrative being pushed? Yeah, so I think we need to be cautious, but also hopeful, right? Like, I have no right to tell other undocumented folks in my community to be like my mom, right? Who's undocumented, who's just so happy that Trump is out of office. I have no right to tell her, no, like you can't be happy. Like, no, like Trump was horrible for it was, yeah, it was horrible. So yeah, I think like communities of color and immigrant communities that are rejoicing, that are feeling relief, like that is so valid, but also we need to still continue pushing.
I totally agree with what Nayda was just saying. And Nayda, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, okay.
Nayda. We need to pass, in my professional capacity, I work for a member of Congress, and my portfolio includes immigration and immigration legislation. And there is, if we're going to continue coming back to this conversation so long as we don't pass immigration reform and we do it thoroughly. One thing that, you know, what Nayda was talking about, like with this current administration and the administration prior to Trump, I am very skeptical of everyone, and especially members, no matter what party they're in, because you know, what Senator Hickenlooper did is a perfect example of, we have this assumption that the Democratic Party is pro-immigrant, pro-workers' rights, pro anything that's like progressive, and we have an idea that Republicans are the opposite of that. We never talk about the folks who sit in the middle, which is a large majority of Democrats, who sit very, very comfortably in the middle on these topics, who very much are feeling very uncomfortable about voting to extend stimulus payments, who are very much also feeling uncomfortable about extending, you know, a pathway to citizenship, who would never publicly say it. And I think, you know, what Nayda was talking about is holding these folks accountable is of utmost importance, especially of folks of your own party. I think we too often, and I'm speaking from the Democratic end, we let folks get away with a lot on the Democratic end. We don't follow their votes as carefully and as you know, as closely as we need to. And Senator Hickenlooper's vote is a great example of that. He had so much support from the immigrant community. And then he did this. And when I saw that vote, was I surprised? Not at all. Not at all. Like, it didn't surprise me one bit. Senator Hickenlooper was never the person who was going to go the distance that I need him to go in order to have meaningful immigration reform. So am I shocked? Not at all. Like, not at all shocked. Under this new administration, I am relieved. You know, in my professional capacity, I've been exhausted working under the previous administration. I work a lot on deportation cases. I am exhausted fighting with ICE. I'm exhausted at them getting away with what they get away with, not being accountable to Congress at all. And I'm a congressional staffer, and they're not accountable at all. And so, do I have some hope? Yeah, I have to have some hope, because this job is really hard otherwise. Like, you have to hope that, you know, the Biden administration is going to start to rein in ICE. But at the same time, the proposals that they submitted hardly addressed detention. Actually didn't address detention to the extent that it needed to. So, like, I'm sitting here, sort of like what Nayda is, sort of like building on what Nayda was just talking about, like very much like skeptical, just kind of like sitting back, listening, optimistic because it's a sense of relief. It does feel like a sense of relief, but also very skeptical. I refuse to be fooled again. And so I'm skeptical, and I'm watching very closely. And when it's needed, I will speak up. But I really encourage everyone in this room to watch very, very closely what your members of Congress are voting for. You know, I come from the refugee community. Whatever happens to my undocumented community is a reflection of how people care about my community. I am directly invested in these issues. So it's just a reminder for folks, like, we all have a stake in this, and it's important. If you care about justice, you need to care about all of these issues equally.
I very strongly share this ambivalence that both Nermina and Nayda are talking about, the sort of cautious optimism and concern. And, you know, Nermina, hearing you talk about your parents, and the Trump administration was a really traumatizing time for a lot of people. I think that that's absolutely true. I'm from Argentina. My parents grew up during a military dictatorship. Like, we know these things are very real. You know, people who inherit these traumas as well. Like, we know that these realities can happen, and that the United States, especially if you're from Latin America, the US is implicated in a lot of these dictatorships that we lived through, and that in many cases, you know, not for my family in particular, but in many cases were the reasons that people were pushed out of their countries in the first place. So Nayda talking about, you know, thinking about our foreign policy as well is incredibly important. But when we think about, like, just to piggyback off of what both of you said, when we think about, you know, the criminalization of immigrants, which we keep coming back to, I think about ICE, you know, Federal Immigration Enforcement, Border Patrol, the building up of border enforcement, detentions, deportation proceedings. Money has been flowing into these institutions and bodies and sort of ballooning these processes for decades before Trump was in office. And, you know, there's a reason that people called Obama the deporter in chief, right? So there have been, you know, we can follow the money and see, like, how much these organizations have grown and also become so highly militarized. And at the same time, local law enforcement agencies like police and sheriff's department are increasingly cooperating with federal agencies in this convergence of criminal law and immigration law. And so, you know, I was really both excited to see, you know, all these executive orders get prioritized and passed really quickly under the Biden administration. But as Nayda says, these are not permanent, right? Just as Trump signed executive orders and Biden reversed them, whoever is up next can sign another executive order, and this can just be kind of a ping pong back and forth. And it's going to take Congress to pass really meaningful and lasting changes to immigration law. And again, you know, I said this earlier, but Trump passed more than 400 immigration related policy changes. That's a lot. And some of them were, you know, front page headline news, and some of them just kind of slipped under the radar because he was able to like pass things so quickly and create so much chaos and drama and fear that a lot of things actually slipped under the radar. But and I know, you know, I appreciate everybody's sort of qualifications of this path to citizenship, like what are the caveats, who's going to be eligible for that, and how are these discourses of deservedness going to play into it. But that is the one thing that I feel kind of excited about, because so many people have been caught up in this sort of liminal space between, you know, even between being undocumented, either being undocumented or maybe not being undocumented, maybe having a status, maybe having some kind of legal status, like, you know, temporary protected status, TPS, like DACA, like, you know, all these statuses that in some ways they don't go anywhere and they're not stable and they can be taken away at any moment, and there's not a path to citizenship. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, like, sometimes we dichotomize, at least in the, and I also am not speaking to refugees, I'm speaking more specifically to immigrants and other non-citizens, undocumented immigrants, although I actually think Central Americans I work with should be classified as refugees. And they aren't for political reasons. But, you know, so many people, like, we talk about these opposing things, like you're either here legally or you're not, and actually it's much more of a gray area, and many people sort of get caught in these dead ends, right, or these sort of paths to nowhere. And I think a path to citizenship is something that a lot of us have been fighting for a long time, and that would be something, you know, I want to see this administration accomplish.
Thank you all for your wonderful insights and answers to the question. I would like to open up to questions from the audience. Please feel free to ask directly or in the chat so our panelists can answer.
I could ask a question. I think that both Nayda and Nermina kind of mentioned like there's a frustration with the legal system in this, and also Dr. Rojo. How do you navigate and build power outside of the legal system when, you know, it feels like political gains just might not, you know, really come to a fruitful end? And that's for everyone.
What I think of immediately is building up funds for legal assistance. So like if we can't move things through legislation, even whether locally, state, or federally, I think building up a fund for legal assistance for folks who are in these sort of situations. There's an incredible need on the detention front for legal representation. There are not enough attorneys who could do this work. These are very complicated cases, and a lot of times, and a lot of folks are not connected to attorneys. And there are some wonderful organizations who are doing this work already, like the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network has several pro bono attorneys who work at the Aurora Detention Facility assisting folks, but we need far more than that. I know last year, 2 years ago maybe, I might be wrong on the timing, but Denver created an immigrant legal fund. And so if I were advocating for anything outside of like volunteer your time at organizations that are advancing immigrant rights, my second point would be, you know, ask, you know, to build up these, or, you know, these funds there's a really a great need for legal representation. So that would be one way to do it. And so if you'd like to do something like that, I would recommend, connecting with Remain. They're always looking for donations, and those donations could help them hire another attorney who could be a part of the detention program. But I have to say that, like, if I were thinking of priorities, that would be a huge priority for me, because folks get deported before an attorney even has a chance to take a look at their case. And we need to stop that. We need to find a way for them to get the representation that they so deserve, and that they don't get. So that would be one idea.
Did you want to share anything, Brittney? I don't want to take up a whole lot of space.
No, go ahead. I feel like your insights are probably better in this area.
Yeah, so I guess, like, real quick, yeah, I mean, something our sister organization is doing, Circ Action Fund, they are the political arm of our organization, so they have more like legal leeway to do more things and endorse candidates. But like a strategy that like they're changing is to stop voting mediocre, moderate, quote unquote progressive folks into office, right? To instead elect people into positions of power from directly impacted communities, knowing that like they align like with the values and interests of different communities, and really focusing efforts on like local governance too, right? Like what can like city council, like different positions at the county level, with county commissioner positions. I think like locally, when I get like really intimidated or overwhelmed about like the issues happening at the federal level, I try to zone in on like what's happening locally, and trying to like pass ordinances or like push the local sheriff's office to stop working with ICE, right? And like that did happen here in El Paso County, right, where like the sheriff's office was working with ICE a few years back, and after like push from community and CERC and the ACLU of Colorado, they got sued, right? And they're no longer working in the ways with ICE that they used to. But also I think like there's so much power in community, right? Like power is not with the president, power is in community, and like organizing and like mutual aid networks and like building up local legal defense funds, like all of those efforts are really incredible and worthwhile. I don't know, I've just always had this idea that like when like community will always have your back, and like there's just so much power like locally, which is why I emphasize really like trying to support those local organizations, right? Especially the grassroots volunteer run ones. That's just what I wanted to share.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. You can give our panelists a warm virtual round of applause. Thank you for sharing your time and experience with us, and for everyone else for taking the time to learn about this issue with us. If you're interested in joining the new coalition, I invite you to reach out if you're interested in joining the coalition and learn more about this important issue. Some upcoming events I'm sending in the chat. The first one is the accompaniment volunteer training on Wednesday at 6 p.m. I put the Facebook link there. And then Solidarity is Love, Mutual Aid Towards Abolition, Wealth Redistribution, and Homes for All. This is Saturday at 4 through the Trans Asylum Support Seeker Network, which is based in Massachusetts, but it's national, just a group I'm part of. And then we will be doing a intro to volunteer training next block if you're interested in plugging in more with our work. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me, Peniel, or Melanie.